Hello. Now, some of you may remember that almost 2 years ago now, I reviewed all the Godzilla movies except for the Roland Emmerich one because I don't include that one as being part of the franchise, but since the new Godzilla movie is coming out, and since I already reviewed all the Godzilla movies, I figured I had to do some kind of Godzilla-related videos before the new one comes out, so I figured, why not do a list of my top 10 favorite Godzilla movies. Now, if you want to check out my reviews on the Godzilla movies, just go to my YouTube channel and go to my playlist, and on my playlist you'll eventually find a playlist titled Godzilla Reviews, and there will be my reviews on all the Godzilla movies, and I will be putting this video on that playlist as well. Now keep in mind, these are just my personal favorite Godzilla movies. I'm not saying that all of these are necessarily the best Godzilla movies, because I know some of these movies are actually not very well liked by a lot of Godzilla fans, so these are just my personal favorite Godzilla movies. I'm not saying that these are necessarily the best films in the franchise, they're just my personal favorites. Now, before I get onto the list, I just want to give a few honorable mentions. The first honorable mention would have to be Mothra vs. Godzilla, a.k.a. Godzilla vs. Mothra, which I know might piss some people off that it's not on the list. The reason I'm not putting it on the list is because I do enjoy this one a lot, but I never really loved it as much as a lot of other Godzilla fans did. Another honorable mention would have to be Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All-Out Attack, which actually almost made it to the list, but for some reason I didn't put it on, but that is a really good one. Another honorable mention, and this one I know is hated by a lot of Godzilla fans, but I always enjoyed this one myself, but another honorable mention would have to be Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, which is kind of a guilty pleasure of mine, but that one actually almost made it to the list. But now let's get on to the actual list. Number 10 on my list would have to be Godzilla Final Wars. Now, Godzilla Final Wars was the final Godzilla film, at least until this new one comes out, but it was the final Godzilla film in what is known as the Millennium Godzilla series. Now, for those of you who don't know, there are basically 3 Godzilla series. There's the Showa series, which started with the original Godzilla and ended with the movie Terror of Mechagodzilla. There's the Heisei series, which started with the film The Return of Godzilla and ended with the film Godzilla vs. Destroya. And then there's the Millennium series, which started with the film Godzilla 2000 and ended with this film. Now, Godzilla Final Wars is one of the most batshit crazy Godzilla movies ever made, and this is one of my personal favorites, but it really isn't one of the best, because I know a lot of Godzilla fans would probably really hate this one, because the movie doesn't take itself seriously at all. It's pretty much just a dumb action movie, but I'm fine with that for this movie, because there are really 2 types of Godzilla movies. There are the really dark and serious Godzilla movies, and then there's the really cheesy and campy Godzilla movies. This one is definitely one of the cheesy and campy Godzilla movies, and the film is very much a tribute to a lot of the really cheesy Godzilla films from like the late 60s and early 70s, and and I just love the movie. It's not thought-provoking at all, and a lot of the Godzilla films do have a lot of social commentary in them, but this movie throws whatever social commentary the other Godzilla films are going for completely out the window, and it's pretty, like I said, it's just a dumb action movie, but I enjoy the film a lot. I enjoy it really just because of how batshit crazy it actually is, because not just is it a giant monster movie, but it's also an alien invasion movie, and it's kind of a martial arts movie as well. But yeah, number 10 on my list is Godzilla Final Wars. Number 9 on my list would have to be Godzilla vs. Biollante. Now, Godzilla vs. Biollante is the second film in the Heisei Godzilla series, which was the second Godzilla series, and this is one of the most unique Godzilla movies because it has a very dark and serious tone to it, yet it has a premise which, if handled the wrong way, could have been really cheesy, but I think the movie succeeds at having a really out there premise, but still having a very dark and serious tone to it. Basically, the premise of the movie is Godzilla battles a giant flower created by a scientist who combined Godzilla's DNA with that of a rose's, but what's weird about it is the rose is also possessed by the spirit of this scientist's dead daughter, and in the movie there's also a girl who's like a psychic. It's a really, really weird movie, but I put it on the list because it's definitely one of the most unique and original Godzilla films, and once again, it has a very out there kind of premise, but it manages to maintain a very dark and serious tone, despite how odd the premise actually is. Number 8 on my list would have to be Invasion of Astro-Monster, a.k.a. Godzilla vs. Monster Zero. One of the reasons why I like this one so much is not just is it a great Godzilla movie, but it's also a great alien invasion movie, and though it is a very campy movie, it does have some pretty serious social commentary in it about mankind's dependence on technology, and if you want to know more of my opinions on this movie, just check out my review on the movie. Number 7 on my list is Son of Godzilla, which is a movie that you either like or you hate. I personally like the movie, but I mainly like it for nostalgic reasons. Like, if I were to see this movie now, I would probably hate the movie, but since I have such nostalgia for the movie, it's one of my personal favorite films of the Godzilla franchise, but mainly for nostalgic reasons. Like, I could perfectly understand why somebody wouldn't like this movie at all. Really, it's a kids movie. Like, if you have kids, and you want to show your kids Godzilla, show them this movie, because really, it's a kids movie. It's not a serious movie at all. It's just a kids movie that happens to feature Godzilla in it, but once again, it's one of my personal favorites, mainly for nostalgic reasons. Number 6 on my list is Destroy All Monsters. Now, Destroy All Monsters came out in 1968, and this was actually originally intended to be the last Godzilla film, but of course we all know it wasn't. But what's really cool about Destroy All Monsters is it also features other monsters from other Toho science fiction films, and it also has a really cool alien invasion plotline as well. I absolutely love Destroy All Monsters. I also have a poster for Destroy All Monsters right here, and I actually find this poster to be kind of hilarious because half the monsters on this poster aren't even in the movie. Now, this was actually the American poster for the movie when it was released here in America, and like, the only monster on this poster who looks even remotely like he does in the movie is Angulus right there, but these other monsters, like, that one almost looks like Gorosaurus, whatever you called him, except I don't recall him having a horn coming out of his nose like that. I have no idea who that's supposed to be. I know that's supposed to be King Ghidorah, even though King Ghidorah looks different than that. I think is supposed to be Manda, even though Manda looks nothing like that. That's Rodan. Rodan looks somewhat similar to how he does in the movie. There's the giant spider, who also looks somewhat similar to how he does in the movie. This guy right here, I think, is supposed to be Minya, but I'm not sure. If that is Minya, they definitely made him much more vicious on the poster, and I have no idea who that's supposed to be. Number 5 on my list is Godzilla vs. Gigan, which is one of my personal favorites, but a lot of people really seem to hate this movie, but I really don't understand all the hate for this movie. I really don't. I mean, maybe it's nostalgia that is the reason I love this movie so much, but honestly, it really isn't a bad Godzilla movie. I mean, at least in my opinion, it isn't, but apparently a lot of people really don't seem to like this movie. But even if you don't like the movie, you gotta admit, Gigan is a really cool freaking monster, and even people who don't like the movie say that Gigan is one of the greatest monsters to show up in the Godzilla franchise. Number 4 on my list is 1974's Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, which is considered by a lot of Godzilla fans to be one of the greatest Godzilla movies ever made, and I of course agree with that, otherwise I wouldn't be putting it on this list. But basically the plot of Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla is these aliens try to take over the world, and in order to do so they create a robot version of Godzilla to kill Godzilla, and now the only things that can stop these aliens from taking over the world is Godzilla and an ancient god called King Seesaw. And and of course in the movie you have Godzilla and this god called King Seesaw battling Mechagodzilla. It's just an awesome movie. If you're a Godzilla fan, if you haven't seen it, definitely check it out. Alright, now we're on to my top 3 favorite Godzilla movies. Number 3 on the list is 1984's The Return of Godzilla, or Godzilla 1985 as it was known here in the States. Now, The Return of Godzilla is the first film in what is known as the Heisei Godzilla series, and this is a reboot of the Godzilla franchise, returning the series to its darker roots. And this is a great movie. Not just is this a great Godzilla movie, but it's also a great horror movie as well. Like, it's actually a pretty scary movie, and basically this film acts as a direct sequel to the original Godzilla movie, and it ignores the continuity of all the Godzilla movies that came in between. Now, there are 2 versions of this movie. There's the original Japanese version, which is called The Return of Godzilla, but when they released this here in the States, they re-edited the movie as Godzilla 1985, and when they re-edited the movie, they added scenes which weren't in the original Japanese version. Now, I have seen both versions of this movie, but the American version of this movie, Godzilla 1985, is the version that I grew up on, and it was actually the second Godzilla movie I ever saw. Unfortunately, this movie is not very easy to come by now, because the Japanese version of this was never released here in the States, and unfortunately Godzilla 1985 was only released on VHS. Unfortunately, it's yet to have a DVD release here in America. Number 2 on my list is King Kong vs. Godzilla. Now, this movie has a very special place in my heart because this was actually the first Godzilla movie I ever saw, and I had to see this movie when I was like 3 years old, I think. This movie, I have such nostalgia for this movie, and that could be the reason why I love this movie so much. Now, there are 2 versions of this movie. This movie was originally released in Japan in 1962, but they released it in 1963, a year later, and when they re-released this in America, they re-edited the movie, and this is a case where I've only seen the American version. I've never seen the Japanese version of this, but apparently the Japanese version of this is actually more of a comedy, but when they re-edited the movie here in the States, they made it more of a generic monster movie, but apparently the original version is more of a comedy. I do have to check out the original version at some point, but for now I've only seen the American version of this, but this is definitely one of my favorite Godzilla movies, and one of my favorite monster movies in general. Like, I absolutely love this movie, and once again, it could be nostalgia that is the reason I love this movie so much, but if you haven't seen this, I definitely recommend giving this movie a shot. And my number one favorite Godzilla movie of all time is Gojira, which is the original Godzilla movie from 1954, and this is such a classic movie. Not just is this one of the greatest monster movies ever made, but this, in my opinion, is one of the greatest movies of all time, and in my opinion, it's one of the most underrated movies of all time, because a lot of people seem to forget that the original Godzilla movie is one of the darkest and most depressing movies of its genre, because in the original Godzilla movie, when Godzilla attacks Tokyo, they don't treat it like it's a B-movie scenario. They treat it like it's a real disaster happening. The movie actually takes a pretty gritty and realistic approach to the idea of a giant monster. Like, they treat it like it's something really happening, which is something I really enjoy about the original Godzilla movie. And the original Gojira was actually made as an anti-war statement, and Godzilla in this movie is pretty much the physical manifestation of war. Like, Godzilla in this movie is meant to be a metaphor for the atom bomb, and of course Japan is a country who witnessed firsthand the horrors of nuclear war during World War II. So in a lot of ways, this movie can be looked at as Japan's response to what happened less than a decade before this movie came out. And in a lot of ways, this movie is really more of a drama film that just happens to feature a giant monster as the main conflict of the story, which I can't really say the same for a lot of the sequels that followed this, but even though there are a lot of really cheesy Godzilla movies, the original Godzilla movie is a very serious film. Now, there are two versions of this movie. There's the original Japanese version, but when they released this in America, they re-edited the movie and they added a subplot about an American journalist named Steve Martin, who was played by Raymond Burr in the American version. Now, this DVD comes with both versions. Now, if you get this DVD, I personally recommend watching the original Japanese version, Gojira, but if you get a chance, definitely check out the Americanized version as well, because that one's also worth a look. But yeah, Gojira is definitely my favorite Godzilla movie, and yeah, that's my list of my top 10 favorite Godzilla movies, and bye.